Story 1. The Lantern Beyond the Pines. I went into the woods to be alone on purpose, the kind of solitude that you plan for with a careful list and half a tank of gas. The drive climbed in switchbacks, blue ridges stacked like faded paper, the radio dying into static. I parked below a forgotten pull-off where the guardrail was out and a scatter of beer cans glittered in the ditch. From there, the trail was more suggestion than path. A damp seam that wove through rhododendron and hemlock, disappearing after a few bends the way a creek vanishes under rock. I passed an old stone foundation swallowed by ferns, and a rusted stovepipe leaning out of the dirt like a finger that had been pointing for too long. It felt like the area kept old stories the way the moss kept dew. That was the attraction and the warning. I set my little one-person tent just off a hummock of pine needles where the ground turned soft underfoot. It was late afternoon, grey sliding in early, the air heavy with that wet, resinous smell that lingers under evergreens. I boiled water on a tiny stove and ate sitting on a flat rock, listening to everything and nothing. The quick tick of beetles, a squirrel's scold, a distant trickle like a faucet barely left on. There were no other voices, no distant road, no echo of anyone doing anything at all. That quiet can hold you or it can lean on you. I told myself I liked it leaning. The first hint of something wrong wasn't wrong at all. It was a warm, yellow light threading between the trees, steady in a way electric never is, too golden for a headlamp. I registered it the way you do a plane on a night drive. There, not there, there again, and you don't realize you've been watching it until you're already wondering what it is. Lantern, I thought, immediately. Old school lantern, with the glass and the bail handle, and a flame cupped against the wind. That detail came to me so strong because my grandfather used to keep one hung in his shed, and every so often he'd light it and carry it from nail to nail, oil ghosts licking the air. This one out there moved slow, weaving, keeping distance like caution. I clicked off my own light to be polite and called out, "You good?" The trees accepted my voice without answering. The lantern didn't bob like a person picking their way over roots. It glided just a hair too smooth, not unreal, just practiced. A practiced hand that didn't stumble. I told myself whoever was carrying it knew the ground, lived around here maybe, the kind of mountain regular who could find coffee in their kitchen without turning on the light. Maybe they'd seen my tent and decided to give me space. My chest loosened around that explanation and tightened right back up because the light didn't go. It drew wide arcs through the trunks, always at the same range, like it had found a path and was walking the perimeter of it. That was the first hour. When you're alone in a nylon envelope barely thicker than a raincoat, you don't lie down so much as you agree to pretend this is a reasonable thing to do. The night settled heavy. The light continued its slow pilgrimage, a warm pulse between the black ribs of trees. I tried reading, then counting breaths, then organizing the next day's hike in my head. None of it stuck. The part of my brain that watches the door stayed on the job. Every time the lantern passed a certain gap, my eyes clicked open on reflex. It never got closer or farther. The same distance, the same tempo, the same patience. It would have been almost calming if it hadn't felt like I was the center of the compass. At some point, the temperature dropped and the forest let go of its damp weight. The air turned rinsed, a metallic clean that made every sound a little sharper. I caught myself straining for footsteps. There were none. The light moved. The light moved. The light moved. But the ground didn't answer. Not the crack of a twig or the exhale of leaves. There's a kind of quiet the woods do when a big animal comes through. That hush, that's actually presence. This was the opposite. Nothing acknowledged that anything was out there at all. I told myself a dozen sensible things. Maybe there's a service road I can't see. Maybe it's Somebody night fishing on the ridge where the creek pools. Maybe the fall of pine needles is just too thick for footsteps to register. Those maybes were tidy bricks I stacked around a wobbling center. Around two, a drizzle worked through the canopy. A fine mist that didn't make a sound until it found the tent and began tapping a slow message on the rainfly. The lantern dimmed with the rain, and my eyelids finally got heavy. I slept badly, the way you sleep on an airplane, not truly gone. Only skimming under the surface and rising at the slightest change. Near 3, I came awake feeling watched. A childish phrase that still arrives as an adult and does not care that you have logic and a mortgage. The tent glowed faintly, the light not white like a flashlight, but honey-colored, blurred through wet fabric. It wasn't outside the trees anymore. It was at the edge of the clearing. The shadow of the pole cast a long spine across my sleeping bag, and the lantern's glow moved across it, pacing, pace, 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 a patient animal rubbing its flank against the fence. I waited for a foot scuff, breath, the slide of fabric. Nothing. The tapping of rain stitched a steady seam, and the glow drifted along the tent wall as if carried by a hand that did not press the ground while it walked. There are decisions you never know yourself capable of until you're asked. I didn't unzip the door. My fingers hovered over the tab and stayed there. I knew, without any mystical certainty, just a built-in awareness, that if I pulled that zipper, whatever had been content to circle might decide to come in. Or maybe worse, I'd find nothing. That felt like the larger danger. The idea that I'd step into the clearing, sweep my light, and place a beam on only trees and fog, while the scent of lamp oil slipped past like a thought. I lay back down, heart loud enough that it felt like an alarm someone else might hear. Sleep took me the way a wave takes you when you're not strong enough to brace. When I woke, the world had been bleached to colorless dawn, and the rain had worked its way to a fine mist that made everything shine. The tent fabric was cold under my palm. I waited too long, listening to the new angle of light and the soft drip-drip from a dozen needles before I stepped out. I expected my boots to land near footprints, the simple evidence of some person with some reason. There were none. The ground was a clean scroll of small fallen needles over damp earth, as smooth as if it had been combed. My own tracks from the night before were faint gouges that stopped at the tent door. Nothing else had approached. Nothing else had gone. I walked the clearing's edge in a slow, methodical circle, the way I'd watched that glow do for hours. I widened the search, scouring between trunks, peering at darker patches of ground for compressed shapes. I found one thing. A coin-sized circle of soot on the underside of a broken branch at waist height, the kind of black you get from a flame held too close to soft wood. I rubbed my thumb across it and came away smudged. The smell rose quick and precise. Old lamp oil. It was wrong in the damp air. Wrong in a forest that had been drinking rain all night. It belonged in a shed, in a place with concrete and a coffee can full of screws, not here under living green. The practical voice in me had its say. Oil residue can linger on gear. Maybe the wind had shifted and carried a whiff from my stove. Maybe lightning-struck wood can smell peculiar. I packed slowly, everything returning to its place, each buckle and strap suddenly important. I kept catching that smell again and again, as if my hands were the source, as if I'd handled something I couldn't see. I told myself I'd wash everything when I got home. I told myself I'd chalk it up to nerves and weather and the way memory adds its own shadows when the real ones live elsewhere. On the walk out, the forest felt both indifferent and attentive, like a big animal that knew I was leaving and had already returned to its mourning. I paused at the old stone foundation and studied it more carefully. The stones had fallen inward a long time ago, but on one block, the moss was scuffed away in a thumb-shaped oval. It looked recent. It also looked like nothing. A hiker could have brushed it. A deer could have rubbed. The mind will do you no favors after a night like that. My legs wanted the car. My head wanted the open. I kept going. At the pull-off, the world looked easy again. The silver curve of a highway, a cell signal back on my phone, a paper cup of coffee gone cold in the cup holder. I sat for a while with my hands on the wheel, feeling each finger decide to do its job. The smell of oil flashed so sudden I checked under the seat for a leak. The upholstery was clean, the floor mats were clean, the air smelled like dust and pine. I don't know what I expected it to tell me when I couldn't even be sure I smelled it. I drove down the mountain with both windows cracked and said nothing out loud the entire way home. Days later, I unfolded the tent in my backyard to let it dry fully. Sunlight brought out every tiny smear and pollen stripe. On the inside of the rainfly, near where my face would have been at 3 a.m, there was a faint palm-sized stain, not color so much as texture, as if something oily had pressed there and left a ghost. It didn't show under every angle. You had to tilt the fabric so the light ran across it. Then it surfaced. A curved edge, a suggestion of fingers where the cloth had been taut, the memory of a hand that may as well never have existed. I wiped at it with dish soap, then with a cleaner I use for bike chains. The stain lightened. It didn't go away. I stopped trying. I haven't camped off trail since. Not truly. I stick to places where the paths have names and the rangers sweep through at dusk to remind you about bears and fires. If I go, I pack as if I'm taking a child out. Extra water, extra light, an apology ready in case I have to ask someone to walk me back. Every so often in a hardware store, I'll find myself halted in an aisle, hand hovering over a shelf I don't need. Lanterns stacked in boxes, their glass globes gleaming. I imagine the weight of one in my hand. I imagine lighting it, hearing the tiny wick catch and settle into that small, obedient flame, the air filling with that sweet, metallic perfume. I imagine carrying it into the yard and letting its circle of light wander over grass. I never buy one. People ask why I go into the woods at all if this is how I feel. I tell them that whatever moved around my tent that night taught me something I should have already known. The mountains keep their own schedule and their own inventory. There are paths out there that aren't yours to walk, circles not meant to be broken. A lantern can be a person, and a lantern can be a habit older than your grandfather's hands. The scent of oil can mean safety or story. And if you close your eyes at 3 a.m, in any dark room anywhere, you might catch the sound of rain on a thin roof and the sense that something careful is passing by at the same distance it always has. Carrying a light it doesn't need for seeing, only for remembering where you are. Story 2. The campsite that wasn't there. We found the map on a forum where people post about forgotten trail spurs and overgrown logging roads, the sort of place where directions start with "turn left at the fallen sycamore" and end with "you'll know it when you see it." My friend Eli sent it late one night with a message that said, 2 hours from us, hidden campsite, looks legit. I should have noticed the comments beneath it were split between folks who loved it and folks who claimed it didn't exist. Arguments online feel like weather, loud, passing, easy to ignore. The map was a grainy screenshot marked with a yellow circle and a faint X. Someone had typed "perfect spot, stone ring, bench." It had that lure of something quiet and undeserved, like a deer trail that leads to a cool, private bend of river. We drove out before noon, the sky pressed low, a pewter lid that made the ridgelines look closer than they were. The paved road gave up to gravel, and the gravel gave up to ruts. At a turnout, we killed the engine and listened to the silence spread, The last tickings of heat from the hood, a cluster of bees working something sweet in the weeds. We cut into the trees by a path that might have been made by boots or deer. Ferns brushed our knees, wet and cold, and spider silk briefly tied itself around our wrists like someone testing our pulse. Every so often, Eli checked the screenshot, pinched and zoomed, turned in a slow circle like a human compass, and pointed. It should be just over that rise. The rise was more of a long, tired hill that made our chests hot. The wood shifted as we climbed. Less young beech, more old pine, and then a sparse ring of hemlock around what looked like a deliberate clearing, as if trees had agreed to tuck their elbows. The ground flattened, softer underfoot, a carpet of needles and thin grass, and in the center sat a circle of stones, not random, but arranged with that tidy human intention that tells you where to build your fire. A little to the left, a bench waited, two thick planks laid across stumps, bleached grey and furred with lichen at the edges. Everything about it felt recently used and somehow still abandoned, the way a half-swept porch feels lived in even if no one's there. We dropped our packs with the sound a body makes when it sits after a long day. I ran my fingers over the bench. The wood was dry and warm, and left a dusting of soft green on my skin. It felt like the sort of place you find by accident and then keep to yourself, a secret exchanged for good behavior. We set up quickly without saying much, the ritual of it swallowing time. Tent staked where the ground looked least root-tangled. A small fire coaxed into being with pencil-thin sticks, water working toward a boil. The afternoon gathered itself into long shadows while we talked the way people do when they think they have the whole night, slow, unhurried, with pockets of silence that didn't need filling. Dusk came like a curtain unfurling from the trees. The forest reassembled its sounds into a different pattern, fewer birds, more leaf breath, the soft cough of the fire drawing in air. We ate from foil pouches shoulder to shoulder on the bench, watching sparks scale the dark. When the last light folded away, the clearing felt like an island on a black lake. Eli told a story about a park ranger farther south who would find whole campsites dragged 20 feet overnight by teenagers and have to pretend he believed it was bears. I said I'd always thought the wildest thing you could meet in the woods after dark was another person. It didn't land as a joke. We were both listening now to the night, like two men with the same secret. The first step was far enough away to be ignorable. If you've spent any time outdoors, you learn that squirrels sound like deer, and deer sound like people, and people almost never sound like anything you can explain. We paused, looked at each other, kept speaking. The second pass around the clearing pressed down on the leaves in a slow, measured way, a rhythm more thoughtful than any animal I knew. It covered half the circle, then thinned into silence. The sort of silence that's not absence, but a hand pressed over a mouth. A while later, the sound resumed at a different point, closing the distance, then halting again as if deciding which part of us it wanted to notice. We called out, each of us trying to strike a tone halfway between friendly and stern. "Hey there," I said. "We're camped up." The fire cracked once like punctuation. Nothing answered. It's strange how your mind keeps offering reasonable things to stand between you and your fear. A hiker late to a campsite, a hunter cutting around us to avoid a confrontation, a neighbor who didn't like strangers using an old family place. We built each possibility into a small shelter and stood underneath it. Around midnight, the footsteps got quieter and closer. At times we felt them more than heard them, the sense of leaf litter moved by weight. Then the pattern changed, and where there should have been a footfall, there was only a seam of uninterrupted stillness, yet the knowing of something tracing the arc remained, like wind looking for a way in. Eli took 3 steps toward the dark with his headlamp and stopped as if he'd reached a fence he didn't want to climb. "Do you see anything?" I asked. He shook his head once, the beam swinging across trunks and catching nothing but bark. We sat with the fire until it was a shallow glow, the coals radiating steady as breath. Whatever circled us did not rush. It moved like it had all the night it needed, and the patience of it felt almost polite, almost the way a host lingers near a door while guests collect their coat and keys. Sleep felt foolish, but being awake felt worse. An endless game of waiting for a footstep that sometimes came and sometimes didn't. Sometime after 2, we gave up pretending we weren't scared and crawled into the tent in our clothes. The fabric pulled the night close and changed the world to one of inches. I could hear Eli's breathing steady and then begin that uneven rhythm that means your body is trying to rest despite your mind. I lay there cataloguing the small, familiar sounds. A branch giving up its grip on another branch. The soft hiss as it fell through needles, a moth working itself stupid against the mesh, the particular friction of my jacket when I shifted. When the steps resumed, they did so with the casual certainty of something that had always been walking, and each pass took longer, the path wider. At some point the sense of a circle collapsed, and I couldn't place where the perimeter was. It felt like we were inside a moving shape instead of the shape moving around us. At first light, no miracle sunrise, just a gradual lifting of dark. We packed with the hurried quiet of people late to something important. The bench looked harmless again. The stones looked like stones. We stamped out the last warm glow in the ring and shouldered our packs. When I straightened, the clearing was gone. It wasn't a blink trick or a misstep. We were standing in dense brush between 2 hemlocks whose lower branches knotted together like fingers. The ground I'd pitched on, tamped flat, slightly cupped, was now sloped and rough with roots. The fire ring had become a scatter of random rocks, damp and slick with moss, none of them bearing the grey ash smudge I expected to see. The bench had unmade itself into a fallen trunk so overgrown I couldn't read it as lumber in any light. Only 2 things connected us to the place I swear we'd lived in for an evening. The dew-dark impressions where our sleeping bags had been, and a narrow strip of dry earth that matched the exact shape of the tent floor, as if some invisible tarp had kept the night from touching that patch. We didn't speak for a long minute. There was no drama in it. Even our fear felt methodical. We went where the fire ring had been and pushed aside leaves. No charcoal. We peered into the bramble, half expecting to find the bench dragged 6 feet away like a prank. The bramble was thick all the way back to the trees, and when I pried a branch aside, the smell of green sap filled my mouth. We found a cigarette butt under a stump that looked like it had been there through a season of snow and thaw, its filter swollen and brown. We found a bottle cap flattened into a coin. We found nothing with our fingerprints on it. I picked up a stone, turned it over, and pressed my thumb into a patch of darker color that should have been soot. It dusted off as lichen, a soft vegetable smear that left my skin smelling like crushed leaves. I think there are places that behave when watched and fall apart when you look away. On the walk out, I memorized tree shapes and small markers. A rock shaped like a dog's head, a patch of ground where somebody had spilled concrete half a century ago, a hollow in a trunk that looked like a mouth. I told myself that if we could find those again in the right order, the clearing would politely return. Eli kept checking the screenshot and comparing it to the land as if pixels could shame the world into staying still. We stepped back onto the logging road like 2 people crossing from one room to another at a party and not recognizing anyone in the new room. The car sat where we'd left it. Ordinary as a house cat. Back home, the tent smelled like wet weeds and the faint burn of nylon that's been near heat. The sleeping bags carried the dew smell you get when you've been rained on without the rain. Days later, when I unrolled mine to air it out, I found pine needles arranged along the zipper teeth as if someone had carefully tucked them there. It's not evidence of anything. Needles get everywhere. Still, I brushed them off with more care than they deserved, and one of them clung to the fabric longer than it should have, bending, then letting go. At night that week, I woke twice hearing footsteps that were only the upstairs neighbor, only the shift of the building in wind, only my own heart trying on a sound to see how it fit. Eli and I went back once, months later, in a different season, because there is a part of you that needs the story to fold in a way your hands can hold. The turn-off was the same, the ruts deeper. We walked to where the rise began and paused in the same spot as if waiting for permission. The forest had changed its clothes, leaves down, bark darker, the world more see-through. We found the stand of hemlock, and beyond it the place where everything had felt open. This time it was a maze of saplings and briars grown tight as wire. I saw the bench anyway in a certain arrangement of logs, and Eli saw the fire ring in a toothy half-circle of stone, and we understood that the mind makes furniture out of scattered parts when it needs a place to sit. We stood there until the cold convinced us to go, and when we turned, I felt watched, not threatened, not loved, just noticed, like a shopkeeper tracking a stranger as they move toward the door. I don't tell this to prove anything. I tell it because sometimes the mountain keeps a room ready for a night and then takes it back in the morning, and you can accuse the land of a trick all you like, and it won't bother to answer. That unmarked campsite existed for us when we needed it, and refused to exist when we wanted a picture. I still camp, but I pick places with names and rules, where a ranger might knock on your cooler to scare off the raccoons. When I pass a clearing now, I try not to look directly at it, the way you avoid staring at somebody's lit window when you drive at night. You can feel at home for a few hours in someone else's house, but morning is for owners, and footsteps, even careful ones, leave no prints when the floor was never there. Story 3. The voice under the rainfly. The rain had been steady since late afternoon, the kind that never truly pours but never lets up either, just an endless whisper on the canopy, filling every hollow sound the forest might have made. My tent was pitched on a soft rise, the earth spongy from days of wet, and by the time I zipped myself in for the night, the nylon walls were cool to the touch. The wind came in low sweeps, rattling the rainfly so it sounded like someone running their fingers along a tarp. I'd camped in storms before. It didn't bother me. If anything, the weather felt like a shield, a curtain between me and whatever else might move in the woods. I drifted in and out of sleep to the rhythm of the rain and wind, the tent shifting ever so slightly in the gusts. Sometime after 2, I woke for no particular reason. The first thing I noticed was that the wind had gone still. The rain was still falling, but softer now, more deliberate. And beneath that sound was something else, a voice. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the narrow space between the tent wall and the rainfly, that thin pocket where condensation collects, where a mouse might crawl or a leaf might get trapped. The voice was low, almost level with my head, speaking in a tone so measured it felt like it was choosing each syllable with care. I couldn't make out the words at first. Then I realized it wasn't many words at all, just 3, over and over, quite enough that I had to hold my breath to hear, the way you talk to a skittish dog or a child you didn't want to scare. I froze there in my sleeping bag, listening, trying to match the sound to something rational. Maybe the water dripping in some strange rhythm, maybe branches brushing in a way that mimicked speech. But the longer I listened, the less it sounded like an accident. There were pauses, inflection. The words, whatever they were, sometimes rose like a question, sometimes fell like an answer. I felt my throat go dry. I reached for my flashlight, careful not to make the fabric crinkle too loud, and clicked it on. The light filled the inside of the tent with a dull, yellow glow. The voice stopped instantly, like it had been waiting for me to react. I held still, the rain pattering above me, the forest suddenly enormous and empty again. After a long minute, I told myself I'd imagined it. I unzipped the tent door just far enough to peer into the space between the wall and the rainfly, sweeping the flashlight beam through the gap. There was nothing, just wet nylon, slick and dark. The beam caught on drops sliding down the fabric. Beyond that, the forest dripped steadily, unremarkable. I zipped the flap shut, more quickly than I meant to, and lay back down. My heart thudded loud enough I thought it might fill the silence. Sleep didn't come again. I lay awake, every small sound exaggerated, waiting for the voice to start up. It didn't. The rain thinned to occasional taps, the sky lightened by degrees, and I knew dawn was coming. When it did, I felt wrung out, my thoughts clinging to the voice like wet clothes. I stepped out into the clearing. The ground was untouched, no footprints, no scuffs, not even the displaced pattern of leaves you'd expect from someone walking around. I circled the tent, looking for anything, a track, a sign of where someone might have stood. Nothing. It was as if the night had passed without a single visitor. Then I saw it. On the inside of the rainfly, at about shoulder height, there was a single handprint in dried mud, clear enough to see the spread of the fingers, the blunt arc of the palm. The impression was reversed, as if the hand had been pressed from the inside of that narrow space. The space I'd heard the voice from, pushing outward toward me. I touched it without meaning to. The mud was cold and faintly damp, the edges already flaking under my fingertip. I took the rainfly down and packed quickly, though I couldn't tell you why. The trees looked the same as they had the day before. The air smelled of wet leaves and pine sap, everything ordinary. But that handprint stayed vivid in my mind, more so than the whisper itself. There's something about a voice. It can twist in memory, turn into anything you want it to be. A handprint is proof that something was close enough to touch. I've camped in the Blue Ridge plenty since that night. I've heard coyotes, barred owls, even the sound of something heavy breathing just out of sight. But I've never heard that same voice again. I can't tell if that's a comfort or the part that bothers me most. Story 4, the figure at the tree line. I picked the clearing because it was honest ground, thin grass, a few low ferns, and the ridge rising behind me like a dark shoulder. If you've camped in the Blue Ridge long enough, you learn to set your back to something that won't move. The tree line curved around in a shallow horseshoe, poplar and hemlock making a wall that softened the wind. Late afternoon light moved through the trunks like water through a colander, speckling everything gold. I cooked early, a small fire more for company than heat, and listened for the day's last things, the abrupt bark of a squirrel that doesn't want to be wrong, a jay still arguing with nobody, a plane too high and far to matter. I saw the figure because I was not looking for it. My eyes had gone loose the way they do when you stare at the distance long enough. One heartbeat, there was only trees. The next, there was a taller vertical line among them that didn't belong. A person at the edge of the woods, motionless, shoulders squared toward me, not close enough to read a face, not far enough to ignore. I stood and called across that space like you do when you think your voice can turn a stranger into a neighbor. "You all right?" The sound traveled out, bumped along the trunks, thinned, and came back as nothing. No shift, no acknowledgement. It felt like yelling into a photograph. I told myself, hiker. I told myself, hunter checking a line. I told myself, survey crew, though it was late for work. The body had that patient, practical stillness of someone deciding if they want the hassle of a conversation. I raised my arms in a question and got the same answer silence always gives. The fire popped and made me twitch. By the time I looked back from that small domestic betrayal of sound, dusk had thinned the figure into the forest. The place where it had been was now only arrangement. 2 saplings, a darker trunk, a wedge of shadow. I stared until my eyes watered, trying to force edges to admit they'd been a person. After full dark, the ridge made a clean line against a sky the color of the inside of a mussel shell. The moon hadn't climbed yet. I worked my headlamp low, film over the beam with my fingers so I wouldn't torch the trees, and tried not to aim it where my fear wanted me to. I told myself I'd imagined it, that I'd built a human out of a gap and a wish. The night accepted the lie. An hour later, when I swung the light along the tree line again because you always check windows twice before bed, the figure had returned. Not in the same place. Closer and 20 yards to the left, where a deadfall made a door into nothing. The pose hadn't changed. Square to me, waiting. There's a way your stomach learns the radius of your safety before your head admits the circle exists. Mine tightened down to the dirt ring of my fire. Friend, I said, too formal, and the word felt strange in my mouth. You okay? I felt childish for asking. It is always both too much and not enough to demand that the dark explain itself. I reached for scenarios that would save me. Maybe he was lost and ashamed to say so. Maybe he was drunk and working through the script of coming closer. Maybe the ridge held the boundary of someone's property older than any sign, and I had pitched in a wrong place that only morning knew how to forgive. The moon finally shouldered over the ridge and put a soft coin of light on the clearing. I let the fire work itself down to a long bed of coals, crawled into the tent with my boots by the door, and lay in my bag with the zipper ready. A nylon wall turns the world into weather and guesswork. Every sound becomes a sentence you can't quite translate. I listened to the leaves report wind, to a barred owl write its question marks, to a small thing pick its way past the guy line. Sometime near midnight, I felt eyes without seeing them, the prickle you don't need a story to understand. I unzipped 2 inches and lifted the flap. The figure was gone again. And the place where it had been was now only the idea of a place. I let the flap fall and forced my breath through my teeth to keep it quiet. I'd almost convinced myself to sleep when a pale shape detached from a deeper shadow on the far right of the trees. It slid into a stand of sapling beech and became a person only because there was no other shape it could be that tall. This time, the head seemed slightly turned, like it was listening to my fire die. I thought about shouting about the sheriff, about company on the way, about a name I could invent and throw out like a dog on a chain. I did none of it. The mountain didn't feel like a place to bluff. I don't know when I slept, only that I woke to silver. The moon had found a gap and poured itself directly onto my tent. I lay still, hoping dawn had come and knowing it hadn't. Curiosity is a trap you build yourself. I unzipped again and peered out, and that's when I finally understood what had been wrong from the first moment I saw them. The figure stood back in the original spot. The body was the same, the height, the squared shoulders, but it faced away. Not turned to check the ridge, not angled as if listening to something deeper in the trees. Back to me, arms at sides, head straight ahead into the forest like sunrise lived there. There are poses a human can hold that feel like decisions, and there are poses that feel like absence. This was the second kind. I waited for a tilt, a shift, the natural fidgets a body will do to remind itself it is one. The shape did none. Time slowed in the way it does when you watch a pot that never boils or a road that never arrives. For a long piece of the night, I was a pair of eyes and the certainty that they were not wanted. When the moon slid on and the clearing darkened again, I closed the flap and lay flat with my palms on my chest, as if my own weight could hold me down. I met sleep the way you meet a ferry you're not sure is coming until it nudges the dock you're standing on. At first light, I walked the edge of the trees with my head down, like a man who expects an apology and will settle for proof. The ground offered none. Leaves lay where leaves lay. No prints, not even flattened where a heel might have pressed the duff into an oval. A few feet into the trees, a length of weathered cable hung from a branch, the fray green with age, as if a swing had once been there for a child already gone. 3 young poplars leaned as if a wind had disciplined them that did not touch anything else. I half expected to find a coat hung on a stump, something ordinary I could accuse of pretending to be a person. There was nothing I could name and too much I could imagine. I broke camp quickly, but not panicked. There's a dignity in leaving quietly when you've overstayed where you were never a guest. The ridge watched me shoulder my pack. The clearing looked small in the morning, almost foolish, like the stage after everyone goes home and you can see the tape on the floor where actors learn to stand. When I turned for the last time, the tree line was only trees, and that should have been a relief. It wasn't. On the hike out, every straight trunk suggested a body until my mind corrected it, and every correction cost me a breath. I told myself a dozen versions that make sense over coffee and daylight. Someone keeping their distance, a prank, a trick of light. They all fit if you don't push too hard. I still camp. I still set my back to the ridge and my fire small. But when dusk pushes the trees together and the clearing becomes an island again, I keep my eyes soft and my questions unasked. There are ways the woods teach you to be polite. Face the people you speak to. Don't linger where you're not invited. And if you must stand at the edge of someone's circle, offer them your back so they can believe you're already leaving. Story 5. The tent that shook at dawn. We went up the mountain because my brother said the sky was clearer where the old fire road ended, and because both of us were tired of blinking into screens. The day had that washed out look the Blue Ridge gets in late fall. Dry leaves the color of old pennies and the air chipped thin by wind. We parked where the gravel surrendered to ruts and walked the rest. Packs knocking our backs in a familiar rhythm. He talked about work the way a man clears his throat. Short, pointless updates, nothing that changes the weather. I matched his pace and tried to ignore how the woods felt more like a room than a world. The trees standing close together as if to listen. The fire road narrowed to a path and then to a seam between rhododendrons. And we found a flat, sandy patch beside a stand of fir where someone had camped before us long enough ago to leave only a memory. A circle of darker soil where a fire had once eaten. A bent stake half buried like a stitch in skin. We claimed it without saying so, staked the tent, and sat with our backs against a log while the ridge turned purple. We kept the fire small out of habit, and because wind climbed over the ground in slow pushes that wanted our heat. It was one of those nights with no insects and no distant traffic, just the trees settling into themselves and, once, the clean snap of a branch far off that sounded like a broom handle breaking. My brother grinned at me across the flames. "Bear," he said, and then, "Kidding," when my head came up. We talked about our father because the dark makes men brave enough to be sentimental, and because the woods reminded us of the way he'd make us sleep on the screened porch during storms, saying thunder is just the mountain rolling over. When the fire was coals and the stars had pricked through, a cold handful only. We zipped into the tent, gear lined like school shoes. The nylon eased the wind to a steady hiss. We lay on our backs, shoulder to shoulder, the way boys do when ceilings are too close. He fell asleep fast, his breath evening into soft saws. I waited a while to let my thoughts settle and counted them off, until none of them mattered. Sometime toward morning, That hour when you can't tell if the birds are late or the night is. Something tugged me up through sleep by the back of my shirt. It was the sound of the zipper right by my ear, not fast, not casual. The teeth of it ticked like a watch being wound. For a half second, my body made the easy story. Brothers up, brothers stepping out to piss, life goes on. But his breathing continued, steady and heavy beside me, a blanket thrown across a log. I put a hand on his shoulder and pressed. He grunted and rolled onto his side without waking. The zipper sound paused where it should not have paused, at a point where the flap was still down and no daylight could sneak through. Then it moved again, down and then up, as if someone outside was testing the tab with 2 careful fingers. I whispered his name. He didn't answer. I worked the flashlight into my palm inside the sleeping bag, not wanting the small noise of fabric to say too much. The zipper stopped. The wind stopped with it, as if the mountain had also decided to hold its breath. The silence thickened until it felt like a weight on my chest. Then the tent began to move. At first it was the faintest sway, like a sleeper shifting in bed. Then the fabric pulled taut between poles with a series of subtle pops, and the whole structure eased 2 inches toward the tree line, like a nudge. Another pull, another inch. The stakes squealed in the dirt. I said my brother's name louder, and he came awake in a flurry, hands out, confusion turning into anger because anger is what you reach for when fear would make you small. "What?" he hissed. Before I could answer, the tent lurched hard enough that the floor wrinkled under us and our pads jammed into each other. A pole flexed as if it would snap. The sound wasn't tearing, it was work, deliberate and strong, the noise of metal resisting. The stakes dragged with a low scrape, like a chair being pulled slowly across a kitchen floor. It wasn't a gust shoving us one way, not the mindless shove of weather. This came in pulses, a series of hands at the fabric, steadying and then hauling. We were being inched. The thought came perfectly calm. Something wants us farther into the trees. "Hey!" my brother shouted and slapped the wall. "People here!" The tent lurched again, harder, and the vestibule collapsed on itself, the guy line gone slack, pegs popping free with little thwacks. I fumbled the flashlight and it skittered under my calf. He clawed at the door zipper and jerked it down. Morning hadn't arrived, but a thin grey seeped at the edges, enough to make the world a shape. He shoved his head out, shoulders jammed in the opening, and yelled a wordless sound that tried to be both a threat and a plea. Whatever we'd expected to see, boots, knees, a shadow, it wasn't there. The forest lay around us like it always had. Black trunks, blacker gaps, the pit quiet of the hour before birds. The tent jerked once more, as if irritated by our interference, and then stopped as cleanly as if a switch had been thrown. We scrambled out barefoot onto the cold ground. The air bit my teeth. I spun in a slow circle with the flashlight beam held low and wide the way our father had taught us for walking tight places. Light your feet first, then your fear. There was no one, no breath, no crash of retreat, no stuttering leaves. The beam found our shoes lined up inside the vestibule, the stove, the little bag of trash tied off. It found the line of disturbed dirt where the stakes had been, and that's what knocked something loose in me. The grooves. The tent had shifted a foot, no more, no less, toward the woods, the lines carved clean through the sandy soil as if drawn with a straight edge. Each stake had ploughed a neat trench, parallel to its neighbour, no wobble or random scratch. The sort of precision a man tries for with a toolbox and a plan. We stood there panting like we'd run, which we hadn't. Not yet. My brother swore into his hands and then laughed, one short bark that sounded like a cough. "Wind," he said, and then looked up at the still trees and didn't finish the sentence. I crouched and put 2 fingers into one of the grooves, feeling the compacted edge and the fresh crumble. The dirt was damp underneath, but not muddy. The stakes were still set, only displaced, each one pulled so the lines made sense in a way no accident would make sense. I looked for prints because that's what you do when you need the ground to take your side. There were none. Our own were everywhere, clumsy ovals and smears, but none fresh enough to claim the work. We didn't break camp. We tore it down. The fly came off in one wet sheet. Poles clattered and tried to spring away as if the tent wanted to be a tent again despite us. The stakes came up reluctantly, sucking free with small pops like bottle caps. We stuffed everything into bags without care. My brother kept glancing at the tree line and then over his shoulder at the open slope behind us, unsure which direction deserved his back. I tried to keep my movements quiet, even though there was nothing to hide from except the impulse to make noise for the sake of being heard. When we were ready, we stood for a second and looked at the place where we'd been. If you'd walked up then, you would have seen nothing unusual except a smooth patch of earth scored by 5 straight lines pointing toward the ridge. 5 tidy accusations that said we hadn't imagined any of it. We didn't talk much on the way out. The forest gave us back the usual sounds as if that was a favor. Wind finding its old courage, a bird testing the first note of morning, a creek mumbling through rocks we never saw. At the car, my brother unlocked it, climbed in, and gripped the wheel without turning the key. "You ever feel like you got told to leave?" he said finally, not looking at me, not asked, told. I thought about the zipper moving when there were 2 of us inside and neither of us had touched it. I thought about the tent dragged in a way that made sense and how I would have accepted boot prints, even a cigarette butt, as a kind of mercy. I said yes. Back home, I found sand in my shoes and a straight line scratched into the side of one stake where it had cut its own path. I kept the tent up in the yard overnight to dry. And when I took it down, the floor had a crease in it that wasn't there before, a faint seam drawn across the fabric in the exact direction we'd been pulled. You could only see it in certain light. I put my palm on it, imagining that small, stubborn movement. Since then, I still camp, but I set my stakes at angles I can read later, and I sleep with my boots close. Dawn is quieter for me now, and I listen for that quiet, like a voice. There are places on these ridges that will tolerate you until they don't, and they'll tell you plain in the language they speak, not in words, not in roars, but in the straightest line you ever saw, pointing toward the woods as if the only answer is in there, and you are not invited to hear it. Story 6. The campsite left behind. I was 4 days into the loop when I found the campsite, the kind you don't plan for but feel the moment you step into it, like walking into a room that hasn't cooled down yet after an argument. It sat just off the switchback where the ridge dipped and the spruce gave way to a scruff of laurel, a flat oval of ground rubbed smooth by feet that had been gone too long. Half-burned logs lay in the ring like bones under ash, still black and sharp at the ends. A folding chair had gone over on its side and stayed there, one leg sunk to the knee as if trying to stand. A backpack slumped in the leaves 10 feet off. Its zipper split open all the way like a peeled mouth. I called out twice, that automatic "hello there," meant to make a stranger announce themselves or a bear change its mind, and the trees took it and handed nothing back. Up close, the chair had 2 fingerprints of dirt on the armrest, deep and smeared as though somebody hot with hurry had shoved off it, and the pack had been emptied wrong, everything still inside but turned to chaos, clothes twisted, a cookpot on its side with a thumb of soot on the rim, a headlamp wedged into a sleeve like it had tried to hide. No food torn, no wrappers scattered, no claw marks, nothing that made animal sense. It looked like a person had stood up from their own life and outrun it. I told myself I was just looking, just making sure someone hadn't limped off into the brush with a broke ankle. I circled out in the slow method a ranger had taught in a class, eyes down for prints that would hold the shape of a shoe. The ground was stingy with evidence. A week of dry days had turned the top layer to crumble and memory. A few scuffs led away and then became only leaves. What unsettled me wasn't what I found, but what I didn't. No story at all, just a pause with the ink still wet. I righted the chair without thinking, and then set it back the way I'd found it. A small apology to a room I didn't own. The light had tilted into late afternoon, that tired gold where shadows get long enough to touch you and the ridge wind chafes the back of your neck, and I didn't want to sleep there, not on top of someone else's last minute. I topped off my water from a seep with a rust-stained trickle, glanced back once at the spot and saw the chair again. Not a threat, just a wrong note, and pushed on. I made another 3 miles by a guess of the sun and stopped in a hollow where the trail widened and a stand of white pine kept the wind from shouldering through. It felt like a safe pocket stitched into the mountain, high enough to catch a bar of sky, low enough to muffle the worst of the night's talk. I pitched the tent on a soft bed of needles and ate by habit, the small chores steadying my hands. Stove hiss, spoon scrape, the ugly comfort of a packet collapsing flat. The dusk there had a resin smell, sweet and industrial at once, like a shop class where no one speaks. I wasn't scared exactly. The abandoned camp hung in me the way a tune does after you walk past a radio. Not loud, just everywhere. I put my own pack under the vestibule with the zipper pulled down only halfway, rain rule, quick access rule, and lay down with the zipper tab of the tent pressed against my palm, because sometimes I like to pretend that's control. Sleep in the woods comes in pieces you trade for time, and I bargained my way down through a few of them until I woke to a far-off sound that was almost a feeling, like someone drawing a comb through hair. The wind had laid off, and in the easy space it left I heard it again. A zipper moving, not quick, not careless, slow, steady, deliberate, the teeth catching in a rhythm that could have been counting. I went stock still. You can talk yourself out of footsteps, blame a squirrel or the press of a cooling trunk, but a zipper is a language. The sound wasn't at my tent. It came from somewhere just outside the ring of my little camp, where the pines threw their last shadows, and it traveled oddly, as if the trees were handing it to each other. I clicked my headlamp off because the light felt like noise. The zipper paused, went the other way, paused again, and then stopped with a patience that made my mouth dry. I waited long past when waiting was useful, then slid my hand to the tent door and in one breath pulled it down and up, out and open, light sweeping low, because that's how you look when you want to live. The ground beyond glowed in the cold cone of my headlamp. Needles, a stone like a knuckle, a beetle stalled mid-mission. My pack sagged under the vestibule exactly where I'd set it, the zipper tab glinting like a small eye. Nothing moved. The pines stood like tall thoughts. I stepped out in my socks, feeling the cold through the damp. The air had that held quality of a house where everybody's gone, but you still don't want to shut the doors too hard. I checked the brush in a slow circle and said no names aloud. The night, satisfied I'd understood whatever it wanted me to, gave me back its usual. An owl negotiating with itself, a drip, somewhere a branch finally giving up. I got back in the tent and lay down, heart refusing to match the calm the forest pretended to have. Morning came strafed and thin, a wash of color that made everything look temporary. I unzipped and stepped out ready to laugh at myself and didn't. My pack was open, not forced, unzippered, as neat as a purse on a church pew. My things had been removed and arranged in a long, perfect line in front of the tent door, each item touching the next as if they didn't want to be separated. Stove, pot, lighter, spoon, water filter, socks rolled together like a single thought, first aid kit, map, Headlamp, food bag knotted tight, bare line coiled with more care than I give it. My knife at the end, like a period, the line pointed toward the trail like an arrow designed by someone who didn't like arrows. My boots had been moved from where I'd left them and set toe to heel at the far end, as if the line wanted to climb into them and walk away. Nothing was missing. Nothing was dirty. The pack itself lay open-mouthed, like it had been told something it could not answer. I crouched with my hands on my knees, the way you do when you drop a glass and it doesn't break and you don't know whether to be grateful or angry. I looked for prints, but the pine needles hid everything except intention. I said, "All right," to no one, a small word that tried to cover thanks and warning both. I repacked exactly as it had been unpacked, reversing the order like I was rewinding a tape, and each object felt briefly like it belonged to someone else. The zipper slid easy when I finally pulled it, the teeth finding each other with that same soft certainty I'd heard in the night. And I had to swallow against the feeling I was closing a mouth. I didn't eat, I didn't make coffee. I broke camp as if my leaving was part of a plan that had been explained to me very clearly, and I'd been rude to interrupt. On the trail, I kept glancing back to make sure the line wasn't still there, that I hadn't imagined packing, that my own order hadn't been replaced by the mountains. The day brightened, but light didn't change the way the memory sat. At the first overlook, I stopped and finally drank water, and when I did, I saw a single pine needle tucked under the elastic of my bottle, too perfectly placed to have landed by accident. I told myself it meant nothing and flicked it into the wind like I was returning something that wasn't mine. I finished the loop in a day less than planned, walking as if I had somewhere to be. Back home, in the quiet of a room with 4 corners, I unzipped the pack and froze at the sound it made. Ordinary, useful, the same small hymn of plastic and metal. And my hands hesitated on the line of teeth as if they remembered something my head wanted to misplace. I still hike, but I do not step into abandoned campsites anymore, even if they're only the idea of one. An oval of smooth dirt, a chair-shaped absence, a pack-shaped shadow under laurel. If I do find one by accident, I fix nothing I did not drop, and I leave as if someone is still there and I am late. Sometimes, laying in my own bed, I wake to a zipper's slow breath, and it's only the neighbor's coat, or a dream, or the house arranging itself on its frame. But I always listen until it ends, counting the teeth as they meet, telling myself that not all kindness is comfort, that there are places that will lay your life out in a line and not take a thing, just show you how easy you are to hold. Story 7. The sleeping bag beside me. The woods had gone quiet hours before I lay down for the night. I'd hiked farther than I'd planned, chasing daylight, until the ridge finally leveled out enough for a small patch of ground where the leaves lay flat and the wind was only a whisper. I was alone, miles from the last trail marker, miles more from where I'd seen another person. I set my tent aside that night, thinking the air was dry enough, and stretched my sleeping bag out beneath the stars. The fire stayed unlit. I was too tired, too content to let the dark be what it was. The forest had that deep stillness you can feel in your bones, where the only sounds are your own breathing and the occasional sigh of a tree shifting its weight. I woke in the middle of the night without knowing why. The sky above was a thin sheet of silver, the moon not yet hidden by the treetops. My eyes adjusted, and for a long moment I thought I was still dreaming. Just a few feet from me, where there had been nothing before, lay another sleeping bag. Not nylon like mine, but the old, heavy canvas kind. Faded brown, seams frayed in places, a zipper running up its length. It was zipped all the way to the top, the hood cinched tight so nothing inside could be seen. The shape was too still to be anything alive, but too definite to be empty. It was angled slightly toward me, as if whoever or whatever was inside had settled in to watch. The air felt heavier, cooler. My first thought was that someone had crept in during the night and set up without me hearing, but there was no gear, no boots, no flashlight, just the sleeping bag. My second thought was to get up, to put distance between myself and it, but my body wouldn't move the way I told it to. My breath sounded too loud, like it might wake whatever was in there. I waited for it to shift, for the fabric to rise and fall with breathing, but it stayed perfectly still. I don't know how long I lay there, eyes locked on the dull curve of that bag, watching moonlight slide across its surface. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. My dreams were the kind that leave no images, only the feeling of being followed through a place where you can't see your own hands. When I woke, it was just beginning to grey with dawn. My first thought was of the bag. I turned my head slowly, but the space beside me was empty. No fabric, no shape, only a shallow depression in the leaves, as though something heavy had lain there for hours. The outline was too precise to be an animal bed. The leaves were slightly darker where they'd been pressed, a dampness that seemed too fresh for the morning air to have drawn out on its own. That was when I caught the smell, faint but sharp enough to cut through the damp scent of earth. Wood smoke, old and cold, like it had been carried on someone's clothes from a fire long since dead. I hadn't lit a fire the night before, and there were no ashes, no stones, no scorch marks, just the ghost of it in the air, threading between the trees, gone when I turned my head to follow it. I packed quickly, my hands clumsy with the kind of urgency you try to pass off as efficiency. The forest seemed lighter in the day, but not friendlier. I kept glancing over my shoulder at that shallow impression in the leaves, as if expecting it to refill itself when I wasn't looking. I didn't stop until the ridge dropped away and the trail curved toward the next hollow, and even then, I found myself checking the ground beside my path. Not for tracks, but for the shape of another bed waiting in the leaves. I never saw one, but that smell of smoke followed me a long time down the mountain, fading so slowly I couldn't tell exactly when it left. Story 8. The Unfinished Campfire Song. It was the last night of the trip, and we'd set up camp in a clearing not far from a creek, the kind of spot that feels borrowed more than owned. The fire was low but steady, throwing that warm orange light that makes even strangers look like friends. We'd been passing around a dented flask, telling the sort of stories you only tell in the dark, half true, half borrowed, all meant to pass the time. The woods around us were deep enough that the firelight barely touched the first line of trees, and beyond that, it was nothing but black. It started so softly that I thought I was imagining it, a voice, far off, carrying between the trunks. The kind of voice that sounds older than the person it belongs to, slow and low, drawing each note like it was made of something heavier than air. It wasn't a song I knew, if it was a song at all, but it had the rhythm of a lullaby, something meant to quiet you down. We all stopped talking without meaning to, heads turning toward the sound. Somebody called out, "Hello there," thinking it was another camper, maybe a group up the ridge having their own night. The voice didn't stop, but it didn't answer either. It just seemed to sink deeper into itself, the notes getting quieter until they were gone. We shrugged it off, tried to go back to our stories. But the silence after it was heavier than before. Then, just as someone started talking again, the voice came back, closer this time. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough to make out the breaks between words, the way the melody leaned one way and then the other. It was moving through the trees, not in a straight line, but weaving. We listened, waiting for it to finish whatever it was building toward, but halfway through a word, it just stopped. Not faded, not swallowed by the wind. Stopped, like whoever was singing had been interrupted or decided against saying the rest. Nobody said much after that. We didn't douse the fire, but we stopped feeding it. Every so often, one of us would glance toward the trees, half expecting to see someone step into the light. It never happened. The woods stayed still, and the song never came again. We stayed up until the embers collapsed into themselves, all of us waiting for that first note to come back. It didn't. By the time the fire went out, the forest had taken back the silence like it was something precious, and none of us wanted to be the first to close our eyes.